Hi everyone and welcome to the tutorial. Today I'm going to be demonstrating how to convert sewn-on patch pocket instructions to knitted-on patch pocket instructions. Firstly, what is a patch pocket? Traditionally, it's a separate piece of fabric that is knit and then sewn onto your finished garment in the desired position. The separate piece that was worked becomes the public side of the pocket that everyone can see, and the garment fabric that it was sewn on to cover becomes the private backing of the pocket. Patch pockets have a particular 3D look as they slightly pop out from the fabric they've been sewn to, which I always think looks really nice. You can easily work a patch pocket in a contrasting yarn or colour for an interesting effect. And writing a pattern with sewn-on patch pockets is one of the simplest and clearest ways to convey pocket instructions to a knitter. Now these pockets weren't sewn onto my finished cardigan, they were actually worked as knitted-on pockets. So you can see that they share the advantages of a sewn-on version, that they pop out from the backing fabric, and it would also be very easy to work these knitted-on pockets in a contrasting yarn or colour. The disadvantage of knitted-on pockets is that it's quite difficult to write the instructions for them into a pattern. It can get complicated very quickly. So that's why today we're going to be looking at how you can convert your sewn-on patch pocket instructions, which most designers will prefer to put into their pattern, into this knitted-on version. Now there are some considerations to take into account before you convert your sewn-on patch pocket instructions to knitted-on patch pocket instructions. The first is, do you want to put up with the fiddliness of this technique, or will it be easiest to simply knit your separate pocket piece and sew it on afterwards? You need to rotate your garment with every row worked of a knitted-on patch pocket, and that might be something you just find too annoying. You also might not enjoy the working of a knitted-on fabric in such close proximity to the backing fabric, because these are made by creating the pocket piece while at the same time attaching that pocket piece to the backing fabric. So there's a lot going on in a small area with our needles and yarn. Your second consideration is, are there limitations in your patch pocket instructions that are too difficult to convert to a knitted-on pocket? For example, is your patch pocket meant to be worked in the round and then sticked afterwards to make the flat piece of fabric? This could be the case if your sewn-on patch pocket is done in colour work. So in that case, it might just be easiest to stick to the sewn-on version of the pocket. Your third consideration is, are your patch pocket instructions worked from the bottom up? A knitted-on pocket needs to be worked from the bottom up rather than the top down to avoid binding off along this bottom edge and needing to sew that edge in place anyway, because we're trying to avoid doing any sewing. It may be too complicated again to convert top-down pocket instructions to bottom-up instructions and then also work the pocket with the knitted-on technique. Your final consideration is, do you like the look of a knitted-on pocket versus a sewn-on one? It is very difficult to work the final stitch on either side of a knitted-on pocket in anything other than stockinette stitch. So if it's undesirable to have this column of stockinette, then you may be best off sticking to the sewn-on version of your pocket. If you've taken all those considerations into account and the knitted-on version of a pocket is still a great choice for your project, then please keep watching the video. We're going to start off by taking a look at just a very simple plain stockinette pocket and converting that into a knitted-on version. And then we'll take a look at a slightly more complicated and decorative pocket, and we'll look at how I would turn the written instructions for this pocket into a knitted-on patch pocket. So we're going to need to decide how many stitches to pick up and knit for our pocket and whereabouts we're going to place our knitted-on pocket. So regarding how many stitches to pick up and knit. If your pattern instructions for a sewn-on pocket are asking you to match a stitch on your pocket when it's finished, you would have lost one stitch on either vertical edge of the pocket to the mattress stitching. So this final stitch becomes a selvage stitch and disappears when you mattress stitch. So if you want your knitted on pocket to have the exact same dimensions as this finished sewn on pocket and you were given a selvage stitch, then you're going to want to remove those selvage stitches and pick up and knit 2 less stitches in total from your original sewn on pocket piece instructions. If you were instead going to whip stitch or duplicate stitch the sewn on pocket in place and there's no selvage stitch, then you can pick up and knit the same number of stitches as specified for your sewn on pocket piece to obtain a knitted on pocket with approximately the same width dimensions. As I mentioned before as well, it's very difficult to work the final stitch on either side of your knitted on pocket as anything other than a knit or maybe a purl stitch. So this may also affect how many stitches you want to pick up and knit. If you need to fit in a pictorial panel over your pocket or are working with a decorative stitch that needs to be worked over a set number of stitches, and again you're not given a selvage stitch in your instructions, then you will probably want to pick up and knit 2 more stitches than what your pocket instructions specify so that you can work your stitch pattern uninterrupted in the center of the pocket, and then you will have that unavoidable column of stockinette stitch on either side of the decoration. So I'm working in stockinette stitch, which means I can be very flexible about how many stitches I pick up and knit because stockinette stitch can be worked over any number of stitches. But my one consideration is that I do want to keep this 1x1 ribbing at the top of the pocket. And I want my ribbing to begin and end with 1 knit stitch. So to make that possible, I need to pick up and knit an odd number of stitches in total. So we'll just pretend that my sewn on pocket instructions say to cast on 13 stitches, and that is to whip stitch the pocket on. So whip stitching, you don't really lose a stitch on either side. Yes, you do stitch down that final stitch, but you can still see it on the right side of your fabric. So externally, the pocket has the appearance that it is that full width of those stitches. So I'm going to still pick up and knit 13 stitches to match the cast on number of 13 stitches. Now, with the placement of my pocket, my pattern uses my collar and my bottom ribbing of the cardigan to help plot out the position of my pocket. So for this pocket, I'm working with the right-hand side of the cardigan when the cardigan is worn. So this part of the cardigan hangs over the right-hand side of my body. So I've got the collar over here on the right and I've got the ribbing down the bottom. So I'm going to count in from both of those bits of ribbing to plot out the corners of my pocket. And later on, when I show you the decorative pocket, I'm going to be working that on the left-hand side of my cardigan. So instead my collar will be over here and the bottom ribbing will be here. So I'll plot out counting from this way and count out my number of stitches. So I'm going to use some stitch markers, and I've got these handy lockable stitch markers, which I love. And I'm going to help mark out my stitches using them. So let's say that my pattern says I want a 4-stitch buffer in from the collar, and I want a 5-stitch buffer in from the bottom ribbing before I place my pocket. So you can use your knitting needle as well to help you count out. So 1, 2, 3, 4. That would be a 4-stitch buffer. So this 5th stitch would be where I'm attaching my pocket. So I'll just use my needle to help me mark that for now. And then I want to count up 5. So 1, 2, 3, 4. This is on 5. So if I want a 5-stitch buffer, that means the 6th stitch is where I'm actually attaching the corner of my pocket, the right-hand corner. So that stitch there is going to be the right-hand corner of my pocket, and I'm going to mark that with my stitch marker and lock it in place. And then we'll just double check. 1, 2, 3, 4. There's a 4-stitch buffer, and then this corner stitch. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and then the corner stitch. So that's my first marker. And then I'm going to count across 13 stitches because I've got a 13-stitch pocket, and we're going to start with this mark stitch as number 1. So we'll go 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13. So that's my final stitch. And again, you're going to count across the number of stitches that you're picking up and knitting for your pocket. And I'm going to mark that stitch as well. And again, you can just double check that you've done that properly on the same axis horizontally, and you can count up 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6. And I know that that position is perfect for both corners of my pocket. We're now going to pick up and knit the stitches that will form the bottom of our knitted on patch pocket. So we're going to grab our working yarn that we're using for the pocket, and I'm using a contrasting colour so that you can see what I'm doing, but again, it actually looks really nice as well if you work your patch pockets in a contrasting colour. And you can use any style of needle you want for working your knitted on pocket. So even though we're working an enclosed shape, we're actually working back and forth in rows rather than working in the round. So straight needles will work for this, as will of course circular needles and double pointed needles. We're using them for working flat. Just pick a style of needle that's comfortable for you and is also in the size that you need for your pocket. So I'm going to use double pointed needles because I think that's going to be quite comfortable for me working over this small number of stitches, and hopefully that's less needle to get in the way as well. Now there are two different ways that you can pick up and knit the stitches for your pocket. The first is to always work on the right side, of your fabric, and the second is to draw through your working yarn from the wrong side of your fabric. So we'll start by just working on the right side of our fabric. This first stitch here is where I'm going to pick up and knit my first stitch, and I'm going to poke my needle right down the middle of that stitch. So we've got the V, we've got two legs of the V because the cardigan was worked in stockinette, and I'm going to poke my needle right down the middle of it like that. And then we'll remove this stitch marker so it's out of the way. So I'm then going to bring my needle tip up so that it catches the little bar of yarn that sits between the two legs of the V. So this is actually the top of the stitch. So this is the left leg of the stitch here, and this is the right leg. And then that actually comes through the next stitch above that stitch. And this is what I like to call the lid of the stitch. So it's the little top bit that you usually can't see because it's on the wrong side of our fabric. And that's what we're going to pick up. And then we're going to take our working yarn, wrap it around our needle as if to knit, and then draw the yarn back behind that little bar of yarn so that we've picked up and knit one stitch. So now we're going to pick up the next stitch directly to the left of that stitch. And this stitch here was the one I just picked up and knit into. So this one here is directly next to it. So that's what we're going to insert our needle right into the middle of, just here. And then bring the tip of the needle up so that you're catching the lid of the stitch. Wrap the yarn around your needle as if to knit, and then draw the loop through so that you've picked up and knit two stitches. And then again, we come across to the next stitch. So this was the stitch that was picked up and knit into. So it's this one here that we'll poke our needle into, bring it up to catch the lid of the stitch, and pick up and knit one stitch. Now the tricky thing about this technique is that it's actually tightening up a row of stitches in my main cardigan fabric, and it actually kind of distorts the appearance of your stitches, so it looks like the next row of stitches is the one that is being picked up and knit. And it kind of is in a way, because that little top of the bottom stitch actually comes into the next stitch above it. So the thing to be aware of is that if it looks like this stitch is the one that's next in line, you want to actually poke your needle into the stitch below it, so that when the needle comes up, it's picking up the lid of that stitch, which is then coming into that stitch above it. I know that's a little bit complicated, so that's where the next technique that we'll try will come in handy, but that technique does also have its disadvantages. We'll talk about that in a minute. So if you also find it difficult to use your needle for picking up and knitting the stitches, you can grab a handy dandy crochet hook. So if this was the stitch that I just worked, this one's the next one, and we're going to use the crochet hook to pick up that lid of the stitch, wrap the yarn around the crochet hook instead, and then use the head of the crochet hook to easily draw that yarn through. And then we're going to put it on our knitting needle, and we do need to do this after every stitch so that we're making stitches that are the correct size. Like that. And you can use a crochet hook that's slightly smaller than your working needle to make this easier as well. You don't want to use a crochet hook that's bigger. And just keep picking up and knitting stitches like that. Now the other thing, if you find it difficult to see where you want to pick up and knit your stitches, is that you can stitch a basting line of stitches into your fabric of your main garment, and that can also direct you as to where you want to insert your needle. So that's how we work the first method of picking up and knitting stitches. Let's now look at the second method. So this second technique again starts with inserting your knitting needle directly into the center of your first stitch. And again, I'm going to remove my stitch marker so it's out of the way. But then instead of picking up the lid of that stitch and pulling our working needle through to the right side of our fabric, we're going to keep it on the wrong side like that. And then we're going to flip our main garment fabric over so we can see the tip of that needle. And we're then going to take the working yarn for our pocket and wrap it around the tip of the needle. Then again, we'll flip over to the right side of our fabric, and we're going to try to draw that yarn that's on the wrong side through as a loop to the right side of our fabric, which can honestly be quite tricky and fiddly. So there we go, I've got it there. And now before I do anything else, I'm just going to make sure that the back leg of this stitch is the yarn that's attached to my ball of yarn. I don't want that to be the tail yarn because I'll run out of yarn pretty quickly if I do that. So that's my tail end of yarn here. So that should be the ball yarn. I'm just feeling with my hands. Yep, that's the correct end. Okay, so again, we'll insert our needle into the next stitch along, and this time around it's a lot easier to see that this stitch was what we inserted our needle into, and that's now got the new stitch coming out of it. And then this stitch here is the next stitch to the left, so this is what we'll now insert our needle into, like that. And then again, wrap your yarn around the head of the needle. Get the tail out of the way, there we go. So wrap it around once and then try to draw that yarn through to the right side of your fabric. You may need to find a comfortable way to hold your yarn so that you can then push it up against the needle tip and draw it through easily. There we go. I split it, but that was successful. And again, I'll just make sure that the back leg of that stitch is the end of yarn that's attached to my ball. And in this case, it isn't. So I'm just going to flip that stitch around. Actually, I'll just flip it around the other way so it's not getting twisted. There we go. Now, if you find that very difficult to do just with your knitting needle, you can again grab a crochet hook instead and insert the crochet hook down into the middle of the next stitch. Wrap the yarn around the head of the crochet hook, and again I'm avoiding the tail end of yarn, I'm using the end of yarn that's attached to my ball. So wrap that around the head of the crochet hook, and then the crochet hook makes it a bit easier to pull that yarn through to the right side of your work, and then you can pop it onto your knitting needle. And make sure again the back leg of the stitch is the end that's attached to the ball, like that. There we go. So you can see that this second technique definitely has advantages and disadvantages to the first technique. It looks a little bit neater because we're not causing that line of tighter stitches below where we picked up and knit stitches, but it is quite difficult to do that pulling through of the yarn to the right side of our fabric. And the other disadvantage is that when we get to the end of picking up and knitting our stitches, our yarn is stuck on the wrong side of our fabric, so we can't actually then knit with it. We have to cut it and then reattach it on the right side of our work so it can then start working the rows of the pocket. So we'll end up with 2 extra tails of yarn that need to be woven in with this technique. With all that considered, I think that the first technique is maybe a better one to go with. So I'm going to switch back to that now, and I'll pick up my full 13 stitches, and then we'll see how to work the first actual knitted row of our pocket. Okay, hooray! I've finished picking up and knitting stitches, and if I just do a quick count, 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, 12, 13. Perfect, I've got the number I wanted. Now, the great news is that the first row of our stockinette stitch pocket is super easy, and we're just going to purl across all of these stitches. So we're going to need to rotate the fabric of our garment so that we can then purl across those stitches this way. So the first row is a wrong side row. You'll need to keep this in mind when you're converting your pocket instructions. My pocket, if it was sewn on, would also start with a wrong side row because the pocket was cast on with the long tail cast on method. If your pocket would instead start with the right side row, you'll have to think about how you maybe cut out that right side row, so instead your knitted on version starts with the next wrong side row, or you might want to add a wrong side row and then start with your right side row instructions once you've finished this row that we're doing now. So we're just purling across all those stitches like normal, and then we'll once again rotate our work around so that we can now work across them this way. So now we're going to start joining this pocket to the main cardigan fabric. So I'm going to take a look at this column of stitches here, which is directly above my first stitch. And I can double check that as well because I know I want to have a 4-stitch buffer. So 1, 2, 3, 4. So this 5th stitch is where I'm going to be attaching the side of the pocket. So I'm going to skip the very first stitch above where I picked up and knit the stitch, and I'm instead going to come to this stitch here. I'm going to use my right hand needle to pick up the right leg of the stitch. So again, if it's a V, this is the left leg, this is the right leg. That right leg is what we're going to pick up. Now I'm going to make sure that my working yarn is here at the back of the needle, and then I'm going to place this little leg that I've picked up onto my left hand needle. It doesn't really matter what your tail yarn is doing at this point. You can push it around here so that it ends up on the inside of your pocket, or you can leave it out there so it ends up on the outside. No matter what, you'll probably just end up poking it through to the wrong side of your fabric and weaving it in, so it doesn't really matter. But we're going to just pop this leg onto our left hand needle like that. And now we're going to knit these 2 loops together. So we'll insert our right hand needle through the first stitch of the pocket and this leg that we've just picked up, and then work it as a normal knit 2 together. So I'll just get my yarn in the right spot, and then we just wrap it around the right hand needle like that and draw it through both loops without splitting your stitch ideally. There we go, and drop both those loops from your left hand needle. Now we're just going to knit across the rest of our stitches until we get to the last stitch. So just knit across them normally. And we're going to pause when we get to our final stitch, which is just here. Now what we're going to do is slip that final stitch knitwise from our left hand needle to our right hand needle without working it. So we're going to pretend as if we're about to knit that stitch and insert your right hand needle into the stitch as you would normally to work it knitwise, and then just slip the stitch from the left hand needle. Now we're going to attach this side of our pocket to our main garment fabric as well. So again, if this stitch down here was where I picked up and knit the final stitch for those initial stitches that I created, we're going to skip the stitch directly above it and instead come to this stitch here. And this time I'm going to pick up the left leg of the stitch. So here's the left leg here, here's the right leg. The left leg is the one I want. Pick it up with my left hand needle. And then we're going to come back to this slip stitch. So we slipped it knitwise to twist the stitch slightly. And now we're going to transfer it back to the left hand needle without changing the twist that the stitch has. And now we will knit these two stitches together through their back loops. So rather than coming into the front loops like this, we're going to go through the back loops just like that. And then we'll knit those two stitches together like so. So what that does is untwist the stitch that we slipped and also align it so that it's sitting on top of the leg of the stitch that we picked up in the main cardigan fabric. And then we have both edge stitches of the pocket matching each other. So we're up to a wrong side row again now. Flip our main garment fabric around. And again, we're just going to purl across these stitches normally. So this is where our instructions start to get a bit repetitive, because when we're working stockinette stitch, every wrong side row is just going to be purling those stitches to end like I'm doing here. And in the right side row, we're going to do exactly like we did in that last right side row. So at the end of the wrong side row, flip our work around again. And again, we need to attach the side of our pocket to our main garment fabric. So this stitch here was the one that we last picked up and knit the right leg of. Again, we will skip the stitch above it and then come to the next stitch. Pick up the right leg of that stitch like that. Just get that into the frame a bit better for you. So skipping this stitch and then coming to this stitch here. Make sure that your working yarn is at the back of the left hand needle, and then transfer this leg onto your left hand needle so it's like you've created a new stitch. And then we're going to knit those two loops together, and on the right hand side of the pocket you're just knitting them together normally. Now again, we will just knit to the very last stitch. We're going to slip that last stitch knitwise from our left hand needle to our right hand needle. So come into the stitches if you're knitting it, and then just transfer it off the left hand needle. So this stitch here was the last one I picked up a leg of. Skip this one and come to this one. Pick up the left leg of that stitch. And now we're going to transfer the slip stitch back to the left hand needle without changing its orientation, and then knit those two stitches through the back loops like that. And then the wrong side row is purled to end. Now you might notice that over here I've got quite a loose and sloppy looking stitch, and the same thing has happened over here on this side of the pocket. You can try to minimize that as much as possible by making sure every time you work your edge stitch you pull your yarn nice and tight, particularly on a wrong side row. But despite doing that, you may still end up with these loose looking stitches. So what I've done down here on both sides is tighten up my loose stitches. So I'll do that with these ones that are remaining. So you come in with your needle tip and you want to identify where the yarn of that loose stitch is traveling to. So generally you need to slightly flip the pocket over, and I can see that this here, the yarn goes through here and then comes out here. So I'll pull the excess yarn of that loose stitch by pulling on that little bit of yarn. And then this travels down to the stitch below what that loose stitch was. So I can pull the excess yarn into that tighter stitch below the loose one and then ease the excess yarn across the other stitches in the row to just hide where that loose stitch was. Doesn't that look better already? We can do the same thing on the other side. It's a little bit harder to identify where your yarn is traveling to on this side. But if we come in here and just pull it apart a little bit, that should be my yarn there. There we go, it's tightened up that loose stitch. And then again, pull the excess yarn into the tighter stitch below the loose one and just pull the excess yarn across the adjacent stitches to hide the loose stitch. I've got one here as well, so let's try doing that one. There we go. And if you find it too difficult to pull your excess yarn out this way, you can also pull the excess yarn out from the loose stitches just across the same stitches in that row. Now you might be wondering what you do to attach your pocket if the main fabric of your finished garment is not worked in stockinette stitch. And the answer is you're just going to do the exact same thing that we've been doing and do the best job you possibly can to make it look neat. So if, say, this was in a seed stitch pattern or a moss stitch pattern, there might be purl bumps all over the place. You're still going to pick up and knit your first row of stitches into the center of the stitches as best you can, even if those stitches have a pattern to them. And same thing with joining the right and left edges of the pocket. You'll pick up the right leg of the same column of stitches on the right side and the left leg of the same column of stitches on the left side. And it will be harder to identify the legs of the stitch if it's not these lovely V's of stockinette fabric, but do your best job and whatever looks neat will still beautifully secure your pocket to your finished garment. Let's now take a look at how to work ribbing at the top of our pocket. So I'm going to do some 1x1 ribbing at the top. I'm going to keep each of these edge stitches as knit columns because I can't really avoid that. And then I'm going to go purl, knit, purl across. You could also do a 2x2 ribbing, you could do a 3x1 ribbing, whatever works within your stitch count and that you've compensated for when you picked up stitches. So it will just start the same, how we attach the pocket to our main fabric. So skip this stitch here, pick up this one, pop it on the needle, knit those two stitches together, and now I'm going to purl my next stitch instead of knitting it, and then knit the stitch after that, purl the stitch after that, and keep going in a knit one, purl one pattern all the way to the end. So again, you'll work your ribbing pattern. Second to last stitch for me is a purl, and then this will be a knit, but again I need to slip the stitch knitwise to the right hand needle first, then pick up and knit. It's a bit hard to see, sorry, because of the fluff, but not this one, but the next one. Pick up the left leg of that stitch, slip the twisted stitch back to the left hand needle, knit those two stitches together. There we go. Now on a wrong side row, instead of purling to end, I'll be working a purl one, knit one, purl one, knit one pattern all the way to my last stitch. And then the last stitch is a purl one. And now I'm going to repeat those last two rows once more. There we go, that's all the ribbing that I want to work for my pocket. And you can see that this is already functioning like a pocket as well. I've also done some last minute tidying up of my edge stitches. So all that's left to do now is to bind this off. Now your bind off is also a consideration. If you're going to work a complicated or decorative bind off, you might be best off binding off as you're working across a wrong side row. If you wait until you're up to another right side row, it might be too difficult to do your bind off while also attaching each side of the pocket to the main garment fabric, as we need to do on right side rows. And if you don't do the attaching of the pocket, you're going to get a flap at the top of the pocket that isn't adhered. This can be fixed by going back in with a needle and thread and sewing down the edges that are flapping up. But seeing as we're trying to avoid any sewing in this pocket, doing your decorative bind off on a wrong side row where possible will save the effort. If you're instead, however, doing a simple traditional bind off, such as having 2 work stitches on your right hand needle and then passing the first work stitch over the last, then you can do your bind off on a right side row. So I'll now show you how to work that bind off while also attaching the bind off row of the pocket to our main garment fabric. I'm going to start off as we have been with every right side row. We'll skip the stitch directly above the one that we just picked up the leg of, and we'll come to this one instead. We'll pick up the right leg of that stitch, place it on our left hand needle, and then we'll knit those 2 stitches or loops together. So we now have 1 worked stitch on our right hand needle. I would like to bind this off in pattern, and my next stitch is a purl column, so I am going to purl that next stitch. There we go. So now I have 2 worked stitches on my right hand needle, and I'm going to pass the first worked stitch over the last. So I'll come in with my left hand needle tip and bring the first stitch up and over the second one like that. Now my next stitch is a knit column, so I'll knit that stitch, and again I have 2 work stitches on my right hand needle, and I'll bring the first work stitch up and over the last to pass it off the needle. Next stitch is a purl stitch, so I'll purl it and then again pass the first work stitch over the last, and I'll keep working like that until again I get to my very last stitch. Okay, I'm at my last stitch now and I haven't done anything to it yet. I'm going to again slip it knitwise from my left hand needle to my right hand needle. Then pick up, not this stitch directly above the last one we picked up, but this one here. And then slip this stitch back to the left hand needle, knit those 2 loops or stitches together through the back legs of the stitches, and then pass this first work stitch over the last. And then you can just draw your yarn through your final stitch, cut that yarn, and there is our finished knitted on patch pocket in stockinette stitch. So let's now take a look at a more decorative patch pocket design, and we'll zoom through this a bit faster now that you guys are familiar with how to do the knitted on pocket techniques. So this is my Chelton cardigan pattern, and this is the pocket that comes with the pattern. So we have a wide decorative cable down the middle of the pocket, and then we've got a wrap stitch detail up the top where the ribbing is. When I designed this pocket, I gave it a selvage stitch on either side, so that if you like, you can mattress stitch it to your finished cardigan. And the mattress stitching helps the pocket to really puff out from the backing fabric a little bit, which I think looks really nice. But with the extra selvage stitch, it means that up the top, your ribbing is uninterrupted and you can still have 1 knit column on either side, and then your selvage stitch is an additional knit column that disappears when you mattress stitch the pocket on. Now you don't have to mattress stitch your pocket, you can also just whip stitch it, and in that case you will see that selvage stitch a bit more obviously, but because the rest of the cardigan and pocket is done in stockinette stitch, that still looks great. So I've decided that I quite like how the pocket looks exactly like this, and I like just having the one knit stitch on either end of the ribbing. So I've decided that when I now convert my sewn-on pocket instructions to knitted-on pocket instructions, I'm going to cut off each of those selvage stitches so that this is the total number of stitches that I'm picking up and knitting. So let's now take a look at the written sewn-on patch pocket instructions. So hopefully you can see here that with my sewn-on pocket instructions, it says to cast on 28 stitches. So because I've decided that I'm going to cut off the selvage stitch on each side, that means that when I'm picking up and knitting for my knitted on pocket, I need to have 2 less stitches. So I'm going to change this to 26 stitches. Now down here, it says to purl 7, place marker, purl 14, place marker, and then purl 7. So each of these purl 7s is going to turn into purl 6 rather than purl 7 because we're cutting off a stitch on each side. So that's going to become 6, and that's going to become 6. Now, thankfully as well, my pocket does start with a wrong side row, and that's perfect because my knitted on pocket will also start with a wrong side row. If, however, this was a right side row, it would be very easy to cut it out because there's not a lot happening here. It's just basically purling to end with the addition of the markers. So I could bring those place marker instructions down into my next wrong side row, this would then be, and all I'm losing is a row of stockinette stitch basically. So that's a really easy modification to make if your instructions begin with a right side row instead of a wrong side row. And now we don't have any specific stitch counts. We've just got knit to marker, knit to end. So that still works even though I've cut out a stitch on either side. So I don't need to do anything to these instructions. And these instructions are all fine too. All of these instructions are the same as well. It's only when we come down to the ribbing here that we again have some specific stitch counts. So the purl 1 here would again be my selvage stitch, and because I'm cutting that out, I will actually cut that out of my instructions as well. And same thing at the end of the row, we've got a purl 1, that would again be our selvage stitch, so we'll cut that out. And then here we've got a knit 1, we'll cut that knit 1 out. Here's a knit 2, so that would instead become a knit 1 to cut 1 stitch out. Purl 2 will become purl 1. We'll cut out this purl 1 here. Knit 2 will become knit 1 as well, and then knit 2 at the end here will become knit 1. Okay, so we're going to plot out the positioning of our pocket again, and it doesn't really matter where you put it. The pattern does give me a suggestion, but it's only a suggestion, so I can do my own thing as well. So I'm going to use the same buffer stitch counts that we used last time. I'll come in 4 stitches from the collar and 5 stitches in from the bottom ribbing. And this time around my collar is over here. So we're going to count out and place the left-hand corner marker first and then place our right-hand corner marker. So if I count 1, 2, 3, 4, this 5th column somewhere along here is where my left-hand corner marker will go, and then we count up 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 is the stitch that the marker is going to go on. And then because I've modified my pocket instructions, I now have a 26 stitch pocket. So starting here at 1, we'll count across 26. And place our marker, and we'll just make sure that's the same row. Yep, perfect. So we'll pick up stitches just like we did before, use whichever method you prefer. And this time around I'm using a circular knitting needle because I've got a larger stitch count, so I need something that's a bit bigger than my double pointed needles to accommodate that stitch count. Beautiful, there's all my picked up stitches and I've just checked and I've got the right number, there's 26. Now we're going to work our first wrong side row. And again, this is just going to involve simple purling, but we do need to also place some markers. So I'll count across using my new stitch counts from the modified pattern instructions. So I'm going to purl 6, and then place my marker. And then purl 14, that number doesn't change. And then place another marker, and then there should be a purl 6 to get to the end. So now in my right side row, I'm just knitting to marker, but I do also need to remember to join my pocket to the main cardigan fabric. So the first stitch of this knit to marker is actually going to be a knit two together with a leg of the cardigan fabric, one of those stitches. So I might want to put a reminder to myself just by drawing a little star or something, that there's a joining that occurs there, and it'll be the same thing at the end. So there would be a knit to end, but it'll actually be knit to the last stitch and then slip that last stitch knitwise, and then again pick up a leg of one of the stitches in the cardigan fabric and knit two together through back loop. So I'll just put a little star there to remind me as well, and that'll be the same for all these other right side rows. So we'll do that now. We're going to skip the stitch directly above the initial pick up and knit stitch, and then come to this one, pick up the right leg of that stitch, place it on the left hand needle, and then knit these two together. And now I'm going to follow the rest of my pocket instructions, which are knit to marker, slip marker, and then there's some things happening between my two yellow markers that I have. So again, slip that last stitch knitwise to the right hand needle, skip the first stitch directly above the initial pick up and knit stitch and come to this one instead. Pick up the left leg of that stitch, then place the slip stitch back on the left hand needle, and then knit those two loops through the back legs. So we're going to continue following our right side and wrong side row instructions, just remembering that at either end of a right side row, we need to join our pocket to the main cardigan fabric. we're now up to the ribbing of our pocket, but nothing changes in terms of joining the pocket to the backing fabric. We're just going to make sure we follow our modified written instructions. So this first wrong side row for me, because I cut out the purl one that the row would otherwise start with, means that I start with a purl 2 together and then knit 1, purl 1, all the way to the end, removing my markers as I reach them. And then when we get to our right side row, my row starts with a knit 1, but instead we're substituting in this joining stitch, and then it's a purl 1, and then we continue with knit 1, purl 1 all the way to the final stitch, and then again, instead of just a knit 1, it's going to be a knit 2 together through the back loop with a stitch from the backing fabric. Okay, so if you've been following along with that same patterning, your ribbing is now going to look like this, and we are ready to bind off. Now, in this case, we again have a 1x1 ribbing. So what we do here is actually going to be exactly the same as what we did for our stockinette stitch pocket. If you have a different ribbing pattern because you're doing a different pattern pocket, you'll again just follow along with those specific pattern instructions. But for us, we're again going to need to first join this stitch to our backing fabric with that knit 2 together, and then again I'm going to bind off in pattern, and my next stitch is a purl stitch, so I will purl it, and then I can bind off 1 stitch, and then again next stitch is a knit stitch, so we'll knit it and then bind off 1 stitch. Next stitch is a purl stitch, so we'll purl it and bind off, and so on all the way to your final stitch, which again needs to be joined to your backing fabric, and then you can bind it off. So that is how you work a knitted on pocket, starting with sewn on pocket instructions. Thank you so much for joining me for this video. It turned into more of a class than a tutorial with how much information we had to cover, but I hope that you enjoyed it. If you did, please feel free to subscribe to our channel. If you have any questions or comments, just leave them below the video, and I will see you soon for the next one.